This is Matthew Lucan from DQ. I'm a strategic consultant. As Jen said, she is my colleague, and she promised not to embarrass me with her story. So good job, Jen. I have two quick housekeeping-like items before we start, and then we'll get into the conversation about metrics and storytelling. So the first one is, just a big thank you. HSBC for hosting us, AbilityNet for partnering with us, all the teams that have been working for months and months and months to make this happen, all the people in marketing, all of our moderators, plus our interpreters. Here we have British Sign Language live in the room, as well as American Sign Language in the video feed. And of course, Jen. Jen is up at 6 in the morning, her time, to help bring this live to you because she is in Seattle, whereas here we are all in London. So the second thing is, I'd like you all to take a deep breath with me. Okay, so I want to echo what Glenda is saying because it's really important to remember that you are a member of a community, a very strong community, and we're all here for each other. So it's important for you to recognize when you need strength, you should lean on your community. Everybody is here, AbilityNet, DQ, HSBC, everybody in the room, everybody online. As we said, there's over 120 countries worldwide today. Everybody is here to help one another. So remember that you're not alone. Lean on each other for support. So let's get started. We're going to talk about storytelling, metrics, objectives, and goals, and how you're going to use those metrics to define goals and vice versa, which is the most important part, I think, because they interrelate, and most people, even as Amy said, don't consider them as interrelatable, but they are. Gamification, reporting, being your own PR engine and how important that is. And then the slide is incorrect. We're not going to have a roundtable. We're actually going to have a QA. So civilization has been advancing for eons, all through the act of storytelling and using that to make sure that information is understandable and relatable. And you have people probably in your team today that can help you with this. So lean on your designers, lean on your UX researchers. They are experienced in telling stories. But because storytelling is about humanizing information, don't overlook your data visualizers. These people are extremely skilled at ensuring that you can tell something with an infographic or a simple graphic so that it's completely understandable and not misinterpretable. So metrics are a way of storytelling. So let's align on some definitions before we get started because we're going to come and use these later. So vision, as we see at the top of the triangle, is the desired state. It's often a sentence or a statement. Goals are statements of ambition. Objectives are practical targets. Missing from the text on the left are CSFs and KPIs. So these are your targets. And then you have metrics at the bottom, the biggest piece. And metrics are how we measure that we are hitting those targets. And so they all are important to work with one another. So to be able to define your vision or define your goals, you kind of need to know what those metrics are and vice versa. The ability to tell your story is critical to growing your program. Regardless of how you tell that story, whether it's ROI or program progress or program health, maybe you're talking about risk or conformance, you're talking about how people are learning in your organization. Over time, those things become super critical. And whether we like it or not, simple visualizations play an important part in this, because this is how people relate things in their everyday life. We show a simple graphic of a thermometer that has Fahrenheit and Celsius on the scale. Now, you all here know exactly what 20 degrees Celsius feels like. You know what to wear if it's not raining, but I don't. But if you told me 70 degrees, I know exactly what to wear. So frame of reference is extremely important, and making it into something that's relatable makes it easier to be understandable. And remember, the key to this part is that you are completely intimate with your program and your information, but other people are not. right? So the CEO or the SVP that's asking about accessibility doesn't work in it every day. So they're looking for something simple and easy to interpret, easy for them to understand on a subject they know nothing about. So start at the very beginning, but also future-proof it. Make sure that you can keep this number running. Make sure that it's scalable. Make sure it's something that you can continue supporting. So what is the story you're trying to tell? What can you tell with the data that you have on hand? Things change over time. So you might have qualitative data at first and lead to quantitative data. But do you have the data needed to tell the story you desire? When we think about ROI, when you're first starting out with a traditional ROI, it's savings over cost. Maybe you don't have those numbers yet. So maybe you start with qualitative messages of how you are saving money or how you're bringing value or how you're creating success. And we'll talk more about that. So there are channels to tell your story or ways to tell your story through portals. You could have multiple formats like dashboards, case studies, PowerPoints, videos. You could have lunch and learns that you record. You could have blogs or vlogs, how-to guides. It's endless. But all of it starts to lead to one thing. It starts to tell progress. You start with a little teeny wiki or a little teeny website and it grows exponentially. And then you start cultivating data for specific roles and for specific needs and specific use cases. So different types of media work differently or resonate differently with different people. Does your organization have a dashboard? Almost every IT organization has some type of dashboard, whether it's network uptime or visibility or number of customers on the website in a specific time. Should accessibility be part of it? Some traps to avoid. So you get engagement, but then you fail to report. So you get people paying attention and looking for numbers, but then you run out of steam or you just can't produce the number anymore. So it's important to future-proof that and be able to support it long-term. You're going to provide content to the wrong audience. So maybe you're doing cost savings to development rather than velocity. And of course, you can convey the wrong message entirely. Maybe your graphic is misinterpretable, or you're trying to show growth, but you have your scale going vertically instead of horizontally. So work with your data visualizers. And it's important to be prepared for key conversations because these tend to happen as soon as you start reporting. Like someone saying to you pretty high up, when can we say this product is 100% accessible? We know that's not possible nor desirable, but they don't. When will this project be done? Again, the key is they think it's a project, they think it's a one and done. They haven't wrapped their head around it's never ending, it's evergreen. Or I don't agree with your data. And we're going to talk about why it's important to embrace conflict conversations because it's okay for them to not agree with your data because it gets you to a different place. So when we think about the importance of metrics, we also need to think about related goals. And I apologize in advance, this slide has some typos, so I'm going to read it with the corrections and you'll hear the emphasis where it's been corrected. But your accessibility goals, not metrics, should break accessibility into achievable, measurable milestones. And to hold weight, goals, not metrics, need to be both actionable and relevant. And those metrics need to be aligned to those goals so that you can have more metrics than your goals per se, but you can't have a goal that doesn't have a metric. What I mean by that is gather as many points of data as you possibly can, but you don't use all of that for your storytelling. Maybe you use it later, or maybe you use it when it's more mature, or maybe you use that data when you see a different trend that you want to convey. But it's always good to have more numbers on hand than what you're reporting. And of course, goals need to be smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So with that, you can take the right metrics, used in the right way, to start bringing insights to what your target is and what you're trying to accomplish. And with the right metrics informing the best decisions, accessibility can become cost-effective and sustainable. I'm going to go back one slide. So another important thing to think about here is motivation. So I was with a client yesterday, and we were talking about a team that kind of doesn't want to do something. But if you start thinking about their motivation and what are they trying to achieve, it starts to make sense. So what are the numbers that you can tell them that resonate with them versus the numbers that you're trying to convey, which are not useful to them or might be frightening to them, right? We are going to automate this to make it easier for quality engineers. But that could be interpreted as you're taking my work away, so where's my livelihood? So being able to understand what they're trying to take away from the number and their point of position can also be an important factor in deciding what metrics you're doing and how you're telling that story. So let's look at some metrics ideas. So let's say you don't have a defect cost. You could use development timings to calculate that. How long are they taking to fix a defect? You can use some guess numbers. So if you take automated defect numbers, you can do a test on an entire site, see how many defects were not caught by automation, but rather manual accessibility testing, divide them and say, okay, we're just going to guess for illustrative purposes for this particular point in time until we have stronger numbers, that we can guess that we would see 30% manual defects higher or of the automated defects. And now you can guess how many defects you might have. So it could be used for estimation. Or you can take a sample. So maybe look at a couple of templated pages in a content management system and see how many defects those have, and then how many pages are like that, and multiply it out and take a guess at how much exposure there might be without having to test the entire site. As we think about maturity models, how do you define the team maturity? Do you look at it from a product perspective? Do you look at it from a program perspective? Are you looking at it from a goal perspective? Are you maybe have a confidence factor? So one of the reports that I put together was, I think this number is 85% accurate because we were using estimates. But as we got more data over time, then we could start saying that that number was more and more accurate. So you could have a confidence factor to some of your statistics. Maybe you're thinking about your project from a program perspective. How many licenses have you deployed? Or maybe you think about it from a team's perspective. How many teams have started the program, made the conversion to your methodology? Maybe you have defined tiers, like the team that is doing automated testing on the digital product, and then the team that's doing some kind of guided testing on their product. And then they've reached to the point where they're able to do manual testing. How do you define those tiers? Maybe a team graduates. They're fully following the prescriptive program that you set aside. They're doing it at the right time. They're testing in the right way. They're responding to customers. They're doing all the things they should be. So maybe they've graduated. How many of those are in your environment? Maybe it's last logged into tools, or how many defects they're generating per sprint. But ultimately, what are the effects on shift left? How much was design able to reduce in the accessibility defects? Can you measure that? Goal ownership definition is also critical, because without ownership, we know that nothing's going to happen. So in an agile world, you might have the lead, right? That super lead, that SVP that's owning that particular agile product, or maybe it's a VP, maybe it's just a product owner, but they're the owner of the goal of making sure that that digital product or that project is going to be accessible. They have to report on it. They're responsible from an agile perspective to stop or solve any hurdles within a set period of time. You can use gamification in that same agile model to get agile teams competing against one another. This team's doing really, really well. They've actually finished their training on time. You guys are only 50% of your training in the exact same amount of time. How can we help you from an agile perspective with the Scrum Masters to prioritize your training time because you're behind? No one wants to be the guy that's at the end, right? You want them to start doing natural gamification because It just happens in their type of work. Our ultimate nirvana is to have accessibility tied maybe to incentive pay. I've seen this once. I was able to do it. It changed things dramatically. But as you think about your vision, how can you further state your original vision statement? Appending onto it something like, we are going to enable leader X, Y, and Z to reach their regulation conformance goals by whatever the rest of your statement is. Now it becomes personal, and you could have multiple goals or vision statements for each product, which makes it that much more resonating with that individual team and shows that they have accountability. So I want to share 4 stories from the field. The first one was the cost of a defect. This is kind of an infamous story I tell a lot. And what it was that we sat down and we said, okay, we think an accessibility defect costs $1,467. And our IT partners were ballistic. That's not the number. Great, we've been working for 90 days with your senior leadership and your CFO. No one knows the number. You know the number? Great, what's the number? Well, I don't know what the number is, but it's not that. Okay, could we work together to find a number that we're both comfortable with? But until then, can we use this number? Here's my math. Here's why I think it's a valid number. And we'll change it as soon as we have a stronger number. So we sat down, we worked on it together, we worked with a bunch of people. It came back as $1,383. So less than $100 difference. So all of that anger and anxiety for $100. In a multi-billion-dollar company, who cares about $100, right? In the second one, we had a team that said, look, we're not going to adopt your methodology, we're not going to adopt your tools because we already have a tool set and it's perfect. We are conformant, we know what we're doing. We said, great. Then you wouldn't be too upset if we did a head-to-head comparison. So we took a completely innocuous, independent website, not something that we owned, something off the general World Wide Web, one that we could agree to. And we said, we're going to use our tools and you use your tools and let's come back. They were proud that they found 8 defects. We found 30-something. When it all came down to examining every one of the defects, 7 of theirs were false positives. They were only able to find 1 defect. So I said, okay, compliance, you're the arbitrator. You're the one that needs to know what our level of risk is. Which tool are we going with? The one that was able to find 37 defects or the one that was able to find 1? The one that we were able to do it in a matter of moments or the one that took 2 days? What's the one we're going to go with? The other one was the team that was adamant that we're fully conformant. Absolutely, great. Can you show me your work? Can you show me your test results? They didn't have any. So I said, great, give me 2 hours, I'll be back. There's 27,000 defects found through automated testing on this website. So how are you conformant? What are you doing to test? Oh, well, the guy next to me told me just to say I was conformant and this would go away. Yeah, that's not how it works. So compliance, what are you saying to the regulators? Because you've been saying that this guy is compliant without any data. Maybe we need to rethink how we do that as an organization. And lastly, we can't meet policy. We need an exception. We absolutely need to have an exception. I'm sure you've all heard that before, right? I said, okay, so similar question. Can you show me your data? How much volume are you talking about? Well, we don't know. Okay, well, let me just do a quick test. Came back, 187 defects. They said, okay, so with your current velocity, can you explain to me how you can't fix 187 defects in the next 24 months? That's not an exception. That's a priority. So the importance is, in these messages, is don't use urban legend. Use data, use measurements, have a common discussion around specific information, that information. Get to a common understanding and an agreement that the data is good and valid and everybody agrees to it. It changes everything. And then make decisions based on data and facts, not on hypotheticals. As we think about the metrics life cycle, consider how you tier risk. Sorry. I'm on one slide off. So, where are we? As you're starting your program and you start to think, okay, I'm very early on, it's important to understand the fundamentals. The two basic questions at first, which is how much risk do I have and how much non-conformance do I have? If you can get those, then you can start growing to any number of data points. Can you clearly articulate risk and can you measure it well? Visualizing your data, being able to put it into an easy way, which we talked about earlier. Where do you put it? You could put it on your website. Maybe you put it on the IT website, but have some kind of way for people to dive into the information and get the story behind it. And those things might be super simple, like web visits or usage of a page, or maybe how many countries are visiting that particular digital property, or how many unique visits by customers. That type of data can help you then triage or tier that particular website. Is it a high transaction website? At the bank I worked at, we defined it as more than 100,000 visitors that, moved money, or did some kind of transaction online. Great. Anything that fell into that was considered high priority. And as we start to think about why that's important, is because when you think about your digital inventory, do you even have one? We didn't. So how could we properly tell how much risk we have if we couldn't agree on how many digital properties we had? We thought we had one mobile app. We had 16. But we didn't have any conformance data on any of them. So we weren't able to tell how much risk we had. So being able to do some kind of estimation of risk. So as you see, like we couldn't do end-to-end testing on 16 mobile apps, but rather we had to do representative samples to get a swag or a guess, an estimate, tying it back to when I said we had an 85% confidence in this number because it was an estimate. But as we got more data over time, over the course of a year, we could get that to 100% accurate because then we had end-to-end testing done over time by the teams as they set the priority for that work. Some other things that you can look at in those digital properties is, as you start to grow that inventory, for every row that you have, now you can start adding columns to the data. Like, do we know their accessibility score? Do we know their conformance state? Do we know who owns this? Are there VPATs associated to this? Do we have third-party products in it? Are there key journeys in here that we need to be aware of? First pass rate is also extremely important. So looking at how things go through the SDLC and how they are measured. Then you start thinking about, well, where can I measure those things? So this is a very complex drawing, but all it's trying to explain is that you have wireframing or designing on the left, you're moving into product backlog somewhere in the middle, and then you're working into development somewhere on the right. And so you can see that you could do some kind of measurement at UX research, at design, at testing at various points through the testing cycle, at the backlog level, at the validation level, at the production level. So you can start to use data across time and see where things are starting to happen or where things are breaking down. As your program becomes more mature, then you can start to see that, hey, we're doing things right and we have the data to prove it because the teams are acting in the line of the program that we've described. They're testing when they should, they're not moving defects forward, they're able to prove it and keep the audit trail going, and on and on and on. And so maybe that team graduates because they're doing it the way they should be. Or how do you show progress? What about bad progress? Absolutely, you need to show realistic pictures of where things are going and try to understand what is happening. Maybe that team had a huge production problem. Maybe they had a reduction in staff that was significant. Maybe they outsourced it to a new team and they hadn't been trained on accessibility yet. Understanding what is behind the data is also as important as having the data. And then as you start to mature over time, the story starts to change. The more data you have, the more your program matures, you start to have more stories to tell, different ways of telling the story. And you start to look for different things of how you understand that data. So for example, we had a customer that had a significant drop, like overnight, in their accessibility score. They were watching it. They were able to quickly report it to the team and say, what happened? They realized that somebody put something in emergency release that hadn't been tested for accessibility, and it completely flatlined everything because it was filled with critical defects. They were able to quickly back that out just by watching the trend line. So keep an eye on the data because it tells you things that you can react to. So let's quickly look at some examples really fast. So on the left, we see issues by severity. Maybe what you do is you start tackling critical. Maybe you tackle all of them, but it can tell a story. And this is data that you can pull out of your tools. Maybe pages with issues, which is the pie graph shown on the right, maybe you tie that to the ownership and you can see, well, wait a minute. We have a team where their pages are really, really high scoring. Maybe not perfect, but they're really, really good. And we have a team who owns pages that are really, really bad. Maybe we should prioritize working with that team with our subject matter experts to understand why are those two teams behaving differently, yet they have the same policy, they have the same tools, they have the same training. What's going wrong there? Or bubble chart data. In this particular second column at the top, we see 17,000 defects in the sports category by color. Why not tackle that as an entire Agile team? Maybe you go into your sprint planning and say, look, we're all going to focus on color this sprint. We're going to give you a micro-learning. We're going to prioritize that. And we're going to clear all those color defects. But more importantly, we can go backwards and say, why do we have color defects? What's going wrong in the process? Do we not have teams testing for color when they should? Are the designers not using an accessible palette? Are the designers specifying something that's accessible, but the developers are changing it, so not building it to the wireframes? Can we pinpoint the problem and fix it at scale? Now you can do a micro-learning, a brown bag, whatever your culture calls it, and have some focus and clear 17,000 defects. In this case, 20% of their technical debt in 2 weeks. That's a huge leap, a great story to tell leadership, and you have the data behind it, and you have the ROI, as well as the improvement in quality, all in one small action. Trend lines moving, trend lines not going the way that they should. I was recently talking to a client and I said, look, I'm looking at your trend line. For the last 3 years, it has not wavered. Yet you have a really strong accessibility program. Why is that? More importantly, why aren't you, as the program leader, asking that question? Because isn't your job to improve over time? That's what Agile's about. But you have a flat number of something like 86,000 defects for 3 entire years. Nothing's happening there. Maybe the tool's coded wrong. Maybe there's a different problem. And then gamification. So traditionally, gamification is used in games, right? But you can use it in websites and online communities and other things. And how we can use it in accessibility is if we think about these particular things, like maps, that's your goal or your vision, where you're trying to get to. Maybe your daily check-ins are stand-ups, meeting with the Agile teams on a daily basis. Collectibles are maybe campaign pins. When you're a champion, you get a pin like I'm wearing, and that's your collectible. Leaderboards, we talked about dashboards. Quests, those tied directly to sprints and journeys. And as a reminder, what does success look like? A program that is including people with disabilities, you're considering inclusive experiences in concepts and design, you're fixing up to 85% of your mistakes prior to exiting development. You have consistently finished up all testing, which is auto-guided manual, in 1.5 hours or less. And maybe you're reducing your initial program cost from greater than 15% to less than 5%. These goals that you can tie to your vision, you can use metrics to track how you get them and how you're progressing to them. So as we think about different audiences having different needs, you absolutely need to be your advocate. You need to be your publicist. You need to humble brag. If you won't, nobody will. And more importantly, they're not going to ask. So you need to tell them. Tell them what you're doing. Tell them that there is value. Tell you're bringing value to the company. You're reducing costs. And you're making better experiences for more customers, which in turn equals revenue. Don't be shy about doing. You have to tell them. Now we're going to quickly go through some slides. I'm going to orientate you to this one. My point is to drive you to the slideware after the event, because we'll show you that they're role-based slides. So in this particular example, we see centralized accessibility team. On the left column, we see measurements. What are some things that they could measure? The second item is accessibility issues by category. An example of that in the right column is area or color contrast, form. This can help the team identify opportunities to improve coding and design practice. So we looked at that number in the bubble chart earlier, okay? Product owners, senior management, executives. Everybody has some number, and you can refer to these at your leisure. And lastly, you should show your state that you start yielding these things from. You want to have good metrics and good goals. So things that we see are that the cost of digital integration is reduced and or contained. You have a year-to-year investment for accessibility has a downward trend. You have a bubble at front to get things running, but you should have a downward trend as your teams become stronger. If you need to continue that trend for some reason, it's because your teams aren't getting stronger, and that's something you can set as a goal. Development cycles, time towards accessibility remediation. Are they doing it in less time? Reliance on maybe external consultations, that should be going down. And or the size of your centralized team should be going down over time, or maybe it's distributed until it reaches full saturation and full coverage over the enterprise and then goes down. So as a reminder, we will take questions from Jen. Here in London, we will take questions after the live broadcast. Jen, take us away.
Thank you, Matthew. That was fantastic. The attendees do have lots of questions, though. And let me get you the first one, because I have so many screens. All right. Where did it go? Sorry about that.
So while Jen's pulling that up, just another plug for Discord. We will be working Discord over the next 24 hours to answer your questions. So you can also put them in Discord, and we'll do every effort to get you an answer. So Jen, you ready?
Yep, I am. So we have here, the only automated dashboard numbers I can produce are from automated scanning tools, which really only capture part of the picture, because many success criteria are not detectable by automated scanning. How would you recommend collecting data for an IT dashboard that tells an honest story about how accessible your product is?
So I would do twofold. In that dashboard, I would have multiple pictures, one for automated testing, one maybe for things you can do through guided testing, and one for manual testing. That way, if you have a team that's not doing manual testing, it's showing nothing, but you're actually going to show that it's a null, right? Not that it has zero defects, but it's a null. It's not being done. By having those three things, you can show the maturity of the team and how far they've come with their testing practice. So having those three side by side works. Now, I personally put a little disclaimer, right? So now we're in a little bit of a UI scenario over those three boxes, explaining and reminding leaders, accessibility can be done with 3 tests in combination, not one as a standalone. All of them need to be in combination, and all of them need to be 100% for them to be regulatory conformant or WCAG conformant. So just reminding them that while automated testing may show 100%, that's not the full story. So break them out into pieces and educate them as you go that there are 3 specific tests, and then can also show your cultural maturity of your program for that particular digital product or the larger enterprise, however you define your dashboard.
Okay. What methodology or accounting do you use to track the effects of shift left by design to reduce accessibility defects?
So from a qualitative perspective, you can use the number of hand-holding hours. That was one that we tracked very well, and it was very easy to do. And as teams matured, right, you saw those hand-holding hours go down. And I also want to stress that in our culture that we made sure that everybody realized that reporting was not punitive. It was educational. So it's okay if you used hours, right? We didn't want you to try to use less hours so you weren't showing on the report a certain way, but rather use the hours you need so that we can track the right staffing, because we also used it the other way, which is if you need more staffing, I have data to show we need to hire more people to help you until you have the muscle memory to do it yourself. Right, so it works for both of us. So report the hours accurately. Another one is, if you're using Axe for designers in Figma, do you see a reduction in defects found through that automated testing methodology? Or the designer sending the wireframes to your subject matter experts in accessibility, are they seeing a reduction in defects? So those are some numbers that you can quantify.
What types of timelines do you assign to different levels of defects? For example, minor issues have 180 days to resolve, critical have 30 days.
Let's start first with getting to a culture that people understand that accessibility defects are no different than any other defect. So you should follow the defect criteria for any other defect. And most IT organizations say that critical defects need to be fixed before production, as well as serious. And depending on your agile culture, I've seen anyone do moderates and minors within 30 days after release to up to 90 days after release. The other big gotcha that I see that people have a missed metric that they could totally pull is age of defects. So the team that does a lot of testing and they find all these accessibility problems and they put them in the backlog and they never touch them again. Reporting the age of those defects, because guess what? Agile says that you're not supposed to have defects that last more than 90 days. So product owner, Agile methodology team, why do we have backlogs that are 2 years old? And when was it last groomed? So throw that statistic in there too, because they're supposed to go through all their backlog every single month to make sure that they fully understand what their technical debt is and is moving it forward for fixing. Having a backlog that just ages and sits there and does nothing is not risk friendly, it's risk averse. And your compliance people should really care about that. So rely on the numbers that your IT team already defines. And if you don't, just look at some things online. There's lots of good examples of how to classify those timelines.
When you were comparing the two tools, or talking about the two tools and the tool comparison earlier, what were those two tools?
Deque dev tools, because our team was trying to make a position that we wanted Deque dev tools, and a homegrown accessibility testing tool that was made by a very large staff augmentation company. That's all I can say about that.
What's a good way to show metrics higher potential customers, or in metrics, higher potential customers that could be reached, have better experience, be spending more money? If the product was more accessible and inclusive, where do we get those numbers?
So I had a client tell me a very interesting story that I was fascinated by. And you'll all laugh because I laugh too, but we're in the industry, so we get it. They saw some kind of login or some kind of sign, maybe sign up newsletter or something along those lines, right? Some kind of form. And they were only getting a 24% completion rate, like really, really low. And so the tongue-in-cheek part I think you'll laugh about is that they were going to take it back into usability with their UX researchers and with customers and they were going to put people with disabilities in there without anybody knowing, and they were going to ask accessibility questions without anybody knowing to solve the accessibility problem as well as the usability problem at the same time without the product owner knowing. And they were able to, within 2 weeks, produce a new version that had an 87% completion rate on that form by tackling usability and accessibility hand in hand with the right customers in the room. Great, right? Great story, write a white paper around it. But the way that they told the story was they made a single PowerPoint slide that said 2 weeks, went from 24% completion to 87% completion, which equals whatever the number was, something like $1.8 million in potential revenue. And then in small print under the bottom, it said, do you want to talk about accessibility? And they just walked it around and showed it to programmers. Do you want more money? Do you want more customers? Let's talk about accessibility. So that's a good example for me as one way you could do it. But I'm sure you can think with that example of many other ways.
Hey, do you have any advice on how to build metrics in a non-technical area where there is no automatic monitoring to fall back on?
Just the old piece of paper and writing numbers down. So I literally would just crunch numbers. And this is why I say it's important to be sustainable. I found some key metrics and then I just calculated them and put time on my calendar and blocked it 4 hours every month and just crunched all the numbers by hand, put them into a spreadsheet, created graphics around it and reported it to leadership. So you'll figure it out. But if you need help, I'm sure if you put it on Discord or if you ask any one of us, or if you ask DQ, we can help you think of different ways that are easy to do and easy to measure and easy to sustain.
You are not alone, Lisa. We're here for you. Okay, so if you're working in a very young organization without much structure around gathering metrics or distributing education, do you have any advice on how to advocate for improving those systems?
Question again, Jen?
Sure. If you're working in a very young organization without much structure around gathering metrics or distributing education, do you have any advice on how to advocate for improving those systems?
I would start by taking an assessment of the actual system itself, if you can. So let's hypothetically say it's just a simple information website, non-authenticated. It has 20 pages in it. Run accessibility automated testing, dev tools, free tools, whatever, and just say, okay, we found this many defects on 1 page out of 20. Let's multiply it by 20. We see this many critical or how many types of defects that you have, and just tell the story. You can then start to build numbers around that, like how much would it cost us to repair it versus how much would it cost us to do it right the first time. Right, in that example of 20,000 defects I used, the calculator was $18 million. It was like, do you have $18 million to redo this thing or fix this technical debt? No. Well, you're completely out of regulation and it's facing Canada, so you need to do something. So you need to go back to leadership and ask for $18 million. You need to figure it out. I didn't get you in this mess, you did. You've got to figure out, and I'm here to help you, right? I've got tools, I've got training, I've got things to offer you, but you're literally not doing anything. And you need to figure it out, right? You can only extend so far, and then you need to have them come, right? So being able to tell some kind of story about what is your exposure or how much money you could save if you were doing it right, or what is your risk if you're in a regulatory scenario where you're either like a bank regulatory or like AOTA regulatory. So those are some ways to simply tell the story. That's just one way. You could also think about it from a time perspective. You start to think about when you really start to crunch a number and say, okay, we've got to take this defect. Someone's got to write the defect. We've got to get it into JIRA. Then we've got to get it back to the developer. Then we have to wait for prioritization. Then they're going to work it. They got to reopen it. They need to read the defect. They need to understand it. They have to recreate it. Then they have to try to repair it. Then they have to retest it and prove that it's done. They have to update the ticket. The ticket needs to go to QA. QA needs to time is that in people minutes. That has a number for your company. You have easy staff numbers like $95 an hour or whatever it is. Multiply the amount of minutes that it took. We could be saving this and then take the number of defects, 100. This times 100, we could be saving this every 2 weeks by not doing this bad behavior. Let's fix it. Let's get the people to do it right. And instead change the culture to let's test to prove that we did it correct instead of test to tell me what I did wrong and what I need to fix and then send it back to you again to confirm. That's a huge cultural shift. So you can tell it from culture as related to money or time. Do we have time for one more?
We do. And let's see. Do you have any advice for advocating for the importance of collecting metrics across teams to enhance storytelling and inform decision-making when it's not considered a priority?
Again, it's what can you do with as little effort as possible and make it sustainable? Right, so I could go into Jira and see how many defects they were creating and how many they were logging. That doesn't take special access. I could assign it to a BA. I could have the BA do it as part of their sprint. I convinced the Agile team that it took less than 5 minutes to put that number in this spreadsheet. You'll come up with creative ways to gather the data that's low hanging and use that first to tell your story. So let's tie it back to the slideware, right? Understanding what you can tell with the data you have at that particular time, understanding the story you want to tell so that you can go to the company and say, look, we really should be enumerating this. Can we build systems to do that? Can we find a budget? Can we find a person? Can we work with the Jira team to run a report, whatever that might be, and eventually lead to that? Then start because you have a different set of numbers, right? So do what you can and tell the stories you can with what you have. Interpret the data, right? Is the glass half full? Is the glass half empty? Both of those are true. Now time for our Excel joke, right? Is it January 1st, 1/2? Or is it half? Or is it, this is an error because you can't divide it?
All right. Well, that brings us to our time. And I want to thank you again, Matthew, for sharing. And also thank you to everybody who has attended today.